In an ideologically split vote, 6-3 vote, with conservative justices, of course, ruling in the wrong direction, the Supreme Court upheld 2 restrictive voting laws in Arizona, a state that, of course, went to Joe Biden, the Democratic candidate in this past general election. And so the Republican lawmakers in the state decided to basically pass laws that would throw out votes that were cast in the wrong precinct. And then the second law is against ballot harvesting, indicating that if someone lives in a rural part of the state or if someone is elderly or disabled, they cannot give their ballot to a loved one to submit it for them. So obviously it makes this whole process a lot more restrictive for some voters. It disproportionately impacts African American and minority voters in the state of Arizona. And so that's the argument that was made in this case that worked its way up to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court voted against striking down these Arizona laws. We have more details for you on this. Let's go to the first video that gives you an example of the reasoning that Alito had in this decision, but more importantly, the type of ramifications this will have on elections moving forward.
Justices come to this decision.
So Justice Alito, writing for the conservative majority on the court, basically said these laws may burden minorities in a disproportionate way, but the numbers are small. So even if twice as many voters of color are impacted by this out of precinct policy, we're still talking about an overall small number of voters in a context in a state in which, as Justice Alito described it, it's relatively easy to vote. But remember, when margins are very small in a state like Arizona, even a few thousand voters being impacted by a policy might, tip the balance of an election. So I think this is a ruling that definitely will make it easier for states to impose restrictions, harder for plaintiffs, voting rights groups to challenge these kinds of restrictions, and could really impact the outcome in close elections going forward.
So this can impact the outcome of elections, close elections moving forward. I think that that's the correct analysis on this. I just want to give a brief analysis of my own before I go to you, Cenk. I just have more of a question, right? I have a question for the purported leftists who believe that you should not vote for Democrats in elections because Democrats, to be fair, are incredibly disappointing. They're disappointing. But they are different from Republicans, especially when it comes to federal court appointments, nominations for the Supreme Court, for instance. And as we know, Donald Trump had successfully appointed and confirmed 3 Supreme Court justices during his term. And now, as a result of that, they're making all these rulings that are pro-corporate and also dismantle whatever we have left of our democratic process. So how exactly is a third party supposed to win? How is this making it easier to create a system in which a third party would have any chance of winning electorally? I just want to know. Can they answer that question for me for a second? Because those are the same people who argue, don't vote for Hillary Clinton, don't vote for Joe Biden, right? Who cares about the Supreme Court? I remember them saying, who cares about the Supreme Court? You should care about the Supreme Court. You should also ask yourselves, why are people who claim to be leftists advocating for something that actually makes it increasingly difficult for the left to win? I don't know, maybe you guys should be asking that question. Because this is gonna have a negative impact on elections, not just in the state of Arizona, but in many of the other states that are upset that Biden won over Trump in what was typically a red state.
I don't know why this is so hard to understand for some folks. You fight like hell in the primaries for progressives. And I've told you, primaries are more important than the general election because that's where you might actually have good choices. And then if you lose in the primary, which sucks, and you don't like Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, it doesn't mean they're the same as Donald Trump or any Republican who's gonna put these justices on. Why is that hard to understand? Oh, they're all the same. No, we tell you how they're the same. On economic issues, they're incredibly similar. That is correct, but not on every issue. And the Supreme Court, unfortunately, is massively important. Guys, think about it, right? Today, there was the other decision we told you about earlier in the show, where the Supreme Court said, oh yeah, you can hide your secret donors that bribe politicians regularly, and we're not even allowed to know who they are, right? Now, Trump appointed 3 justices. The Supreme Court is now 6-3, and these decisions were 6-3. If Hillary Clinton had won, I can't stand that she beat Bernie Sanders in the primary. I think she's a phony in 1,000 ways. But would she have appointed conservative justices? No. She would have appointed, by the way, moderate justices. Let's keep it real, right? But could it have been 6-3 or 5-4 in the other direction, where they say, yeah, of course we're not going to let dark money donors and exist without finding out who's bribing our politicians, and of course we're not going to let them take away voting rights. Yes, that is very, 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 very likely what would have happened. Instead, our democracy just got shredded again because Trump got to put 3 people on the Supreme Court. Please use your mind and use your judgment so that you can understand what the right thing to do is depending on the context. Okay, now, on the heart of this opinion, look, 8 years ago, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Before, a lot of states needed pre-clearance before they restricted voting, because historically, they had restricted voting against African Americans. And they didn't just say, hey, in the beginning they did, but later they got more clever. They didn't say like, oh, we hate black people, we're not gonna let them, we're gonna make it harder for them to vote. No, they say, oh, it is so important that we have a poll tax so that the right people can participate. And we're trying to make elections better, not worse. Wink, wink. And what did it do? It totally discriminated against African Americans. So that's why we passed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is one of the most important things. You remember I Have a Dream and Martin Luther King, now Republicans pretend to be in favor of him? He's the one that got the Voting Rights Act passed, right? And so Supreme Court guts it and says, oh, you don't need pre-clearance. And it mainly affected the southern states that had done this for literally hundreds of years, right? First, they didn't allow, obviously, any voting, and then they restricted the voting. Now they don't need pre-clearance. And so now, but in that decision, they said, don't worry, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is still in place. And so if you bring us cases where there's discrimination that you can prove against African Americans, either by intent or by effect, we'll tell you, okay, then they're not allowed to do that. Well, this was Section 2. So they brought the case in front of John Roberts in the Supreme Court, and Roberts said, oh yeah, you did. It does have a discriminatory effect. I don't care. I don't care. That's small, who cares?
Yeah.
Well, Arizona got decided what, by 11,000 votes or something?
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Yes, these elections are decided, the whole national election based on the Electoral College this time around was decided by 43,000 votes in 3 states. Yet the whole point is the small margins of victory in these incredibly important states. Roberts probably was laughing like, don't worry about it, we'll only win by a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, in this case, there was evidence that it disproportionately impacts minorities in the state, and the conservative justices totally ignored that. Well, acknowledged, yeah, it does appear that that's the case, but the laws itself are race neutral.
In other words,
but they're not race neutral. Clearly,
you just said they had a discriminatory effect. They're like, he's like, well, but I don't want to read his mind, and he didn't do it while burning a cross, and he wasn't in a white robe, so I don't know that he's racist. He wound up taking voting rights away from black people in Arizona, or the Republicans did in Arizona, and Latinos, by the way. Okay, but he wasn't in a robe, so I guess he's not a racist. Wink, take away their voting rights. But Supreme Court probably doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter at all, doesn't matter at all. Good luck with getting your third party elected.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR, so those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.